Now there's all kinds of different people in this world. There's only one pie.
Welcome to the Teammate Apart podcast, Season 2. I'm your host and founder of Teammate Apart, Ryan Rogar. I wanted to personally thank each and every one of the many thousands of listeners who've joined us for our inaugural season in the spring of 2020, and most recently for our mental health focused podcast, the aptly named Teammate Apart Podcast Mental Health Series. Since its inception, Teammate Apart and the content we produce has been designed to teach freelancers, contractors, and remote workers, really anyone working apart, how to build better relationships with those they work with, and in Season 2 it will be no different. In addition to our usual array of experts from the remote work field, we are also talking to a new class of business leader who, in response to what has no doubt been among the most tumultuous years in many of our lifetimes, have adapted their businesses to weather the storm. They'll share insights and experiences that will no doubt make you a better leader in your own business and a better partner for the businesses you work for. So as we kick off what is sure to be another exciting season of the Teammate Apart podcast, I'd like to say just one last time, with supreme gratitude for all the support so far and all that is sure to come in the weeks ahead, thank you. Now, enjoy the show. Welcome to the Teammate Apart podcast, the podcast designed to teach freelancers, contractors, and remote workers, really anyone working apart, how to build better relationships with those they work with and those they work for. I'm your host, Ryan Rogar. Before we get started, financial support for the Teammate Apart podcast Season 2 is provided by R2, a fully distributed brand relationship consultancy. R2 has specific expertise and experience in helping service companies grow, develop, and maintain impactful relationships through world-class brand strategy and design. R2 supports the world's best distributed companies by providing valuable insights, strategy, empathy, and tactical expertise to help them foster truly meaningful relationships from top management to top consumer. If the success of your business depends on the relationships you make, then you need R2. To learn more or to request a call, simply visit r2mg.com/podcast. That's r2mg.com/podcast. R2, relationships squared. Also, financial support comes from teammateapart.com. Leveraging 20 plus years of global agency and creative hiring expertise, Teammate Apart provides distributed organizations with access to the best and brightest creative talent from around the world. Through deep understanding of client needs and meaningful relationships with talent, Teammate Apart facilitates a sort of virtual handshake between prospective employer and prospective employee to reduce risk and eliminate doubt from creative hiring decisions. Take a step towards filling that creative-shaped void in your distributed team by visiting teammateapart.com/talent. That's teammateapart.com/talent to learn more. Finally, financial support comes from supporters like you. Members of our happy little podcast community can make contributions directly to the show by visiting teammateapart.com/podcast and clicking on the donation link. Donations can be in any amount and go a long way towards keeping this show on the air. If you appreciate the work we're doing and would like to get involved, just visit teammateapart.com/podcast, click the donate button, and you're on your way. Thank you for your continued support. And now, on to the show. Today's special guest is Sandra Thompson. Sandra is a customer experience expert with specific interest in emotional intelligence. As a customer experience educator, she teaches the topics of people management and leadership, customer experience, and professional behavior at the Pearson Business School in London. Additionally, she runs a certified postgraduate course in applied customer experience and emotional intelligence. Sandra recently became the UK's very first emotional intelligence coach to be trained by EI pioneer Dr. Daniel Goleman, and will be giving a TEDx talk on the subject in the near future. For a great conversation about being more accountable for our own health and well-being in the workplace, emotional intelligence and how we as leaders and team members can get better at it, and how EI uniquely manifests itself in distributed organizations, please join me in welcoming Sandra Thompson to the show. Hi, Sandra. How are you? Welcome to the show.
I'm really well. How are you doing, Ryan?
I am so good, and I am so grateful for your willingness to come do this show. I think the topic that you discuss, or that you spend so much of your time discussing this idea of emotional intelligence, is such a critical factor right now for remote working teams and distributed companies, but also just sort of for humans. This is just, really critical information for people right now, and maybe more pertinent than ever, now during COVID and all this other stuff. So thank you so much for being willing to come on and talk about it.
Pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Real pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, so let's just kind of kick this thing off. Let's first talk a little bit about who you are, where you come from, and a little bit of background on you. I think that'll help, put a little context around why we're talking.
Sure. So a bit of background. I do a number of things. I wear a number of hats. I lecture at a business school. So I actually talk about emotional intelligence to 18 and 19-year-olds, which is interesting because they obviously have a different take on life at that stage. I'm a consultant in customer experience. So for the last 10 years, I've worked for myself. And the last thing I've recently acquired is a badge. And that badge is all around being a coach in emotional intelligence. And that's been quite a journey because in actual fact, I recall writing a thesis, a dissertation about 18 years ago when the book first came out, kind of significantly impressed me. And it kind of had a love affair with emotional intelligence all that time. So yeah, 3 hats. Emotional intelligence kind of covers all 3, but mostly through my coaching.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I mean, this badge that you're talking about, can you talk a little bit about it? I know it's a very important one and you're one of very few people that have it.
Yeah, so I kind of downplay it by calling it a badge. It's not really a badge. It's a certification in emotional intelligence. So I think the title is the UK's first Goleman emotional intelligence coach. Whew, the beginning and the end. Yeah, so it's a biggie for me because it means that I've been through about 18 months worth of training. I had to pass an exam and I've had to have coachees and I've had to go through a kind of experience of learning my trade. But yeah, it's a phenomenal thing because not only do I understand it in my brain, I've also learned it as a human being. So it makes a bit of a difference.
Yeah, that's incredible. I love it. Well, cool. So let's talk a little bit about just what exactly is emotional intelligence. I feel like this is one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot and maybe doesn't actually mean what people think it means, or maybe it does, but I feel like people sort of use it loosely to mean a lot of things.
So I'm going to give you a definition just for absolute clarity, because you're right. When I wrote my dissertation all those years ago, I think were maybe 2 or 3 books. Now there are hundreds of thousands of references to this particular skill. So emotional intelligence is the ability to recognize and understand emotions in yourself and others, and it's your ability to manage your behavior and relationships. And that's a quote from Goleman, from Daniel Goleman himself. So there's a real emphasis on understanding the emotions that come up within you, and also to be able to read and understand, empathize, appreciate emotions that come up in others. Kind of sounds like common sense, right? But when we think about how busy our lives are and how we go from one thing to the next, how often do we really tune in? And that's really what this skill is asking you to do. It's asking you to stop for a minute, pay a bit of attention, what emotions are coming up, and how can you manage them?
Yeah, I think that's great. And that adds a lot of clarity to it. I think there's a lot of the different sort of external bits of emotional intelligence that we'll talk about. But the one thing I maybe wanted to lead with, and it's been interesting because this is a little bit of a realization I've had kind of in the last, I don't know, few months anyway, was this idea that in order to be really good at working with others or communicating with others or being empathetic to others or any of these skills, before we are capable of doing that, we need to do so much work on ourselves and sort of understand those things foundationally for ourselves prior to being able to apply it to other people. I often use the metaphor of, if you're on an airplane and the gas, the air masks drop down, you're supposed to put it on yourself before you help your passenger, because essentially you're no good to them dead, right? I mean, you need to preserve yourself prior to helping others. And I think that that's so true as it pertains to communication and emotional intelligence as well, because if you're a mess inside and you're not capable of being sort of empathetic to yourself, how could you possibly apply that to somebody else? So I think it's really important to maybe talk about that inward facing bit of emotional intelligence before we start talking about the external stuff.
So the foundation of all of this stuff is emotional self-awareness. And what Goleman says is that you have to master that first. It's if you can imagine a grid with 4 headings, the first heading is self-awareness. And it's a big chunky thing. The thing that we actually spent probably the most, I'm going to say about 70% of the time doing was exploring that. Because when you take some proper time and you start to actually realize what's going on within yourself, it opens up a can of worms very often, because you're understanding where did that emotion come from? Why is it that I feel that particular way? And it's only when you've practiced a lot, you've done a load of breathing, you've done a load of other techniques, where you can actually attribute the reason why something, what we call triggers you, either in a negative way or something that brings you absolute joy. So it is a big area to understand. And I think very often people don't want to go there. They just don't want to go through that self-awareness because it brings stuff up that they just need to understand for a while,
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense. And actually, I think, even just kind of thinking of my own experience, I know I spent a lot of time, especially when I was younger, really working hard, doing what I thought was right, and kind of using the excuse that it was for other people, right? So I spent a lot of time, especially in my early 20s, working for myself, by myself in an office, totally secluded from anybody. I still had a young family at home, so I had somebody to go home to. So I wasn't feeling a lot of the, I guess loneliness or isolation that comes up so often in remote work, because I still had a place to go afterwards. But I was spending 8, 10, 12 hours a day by myself in my office and doing all that, killing myself, working myself to the bone, all under the guise of this is what one must do to provide for a family, right? And so rather than taking any care or any time to sit and think about my emotional needs or where I needed to be during that period of my life, I spent a lot of time kind of shifting my care to other people. And I think this is something that happens a lot for managers and people in a workplace. Everybody wants to practice empathy and sort of being people first or whatever. And so we put a lot of attention on other people. And we work really hard for them, or we do this and that for them. And, really, it's funny, like we're so much closer to ourselves, yet we spend so little time on ourselves. Like it is really interesting. And you mentioned, I think so much of it comes from just not wanting to do the work, or you're afraid of what it'll bring up, or maybe there's past harmful things or sad things or scary things in your past that you're trying to sort of get away from. But it is interesting how if you do take that time to sort of build a proper foundation before moving forward as a manager, as a leader, you are often better set up to do so.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about what you've just said is that when you invite people to give you an insight into what they think they see of you, that's when you start to analyze, where you start to see patterns in what people are saying. So I remember doing a kind of like personality profile thing. It was a bit rough and ready, but it was around, I'm going to say 15 years ago. And I thought I was amazing, boss. I'd go 100 million miles an hour and I was going to do this and I was going to do that. I thought my team were with me and I couldn't understand why I didn't get stuff done really quick. And we did a self-awareness exercise and it was all around them giving me some feedback. And the themes that came up were, you're going too fast, you're leaving us behind. You're really bright, but you just don't know that we're feeling exhausted by what you're doing. And that was a real check-in for me. And, it was at the time, it was quite painful because I thought I was the best thing. And actually, as a manager and leader, I really was not. I was absolutely gung-ho to make the team hugely successful and to smash our targets. But they weren't with me. They were just about hanging on. So that's still part of that self-awareness process. You can't do it on your own. You have to get feedback from people you trust and you respect to get that mirror up. That's really what it's about, holding a mirror to be able to see what's really going on.
Yeah, no, I love that. And it's funny because even just earlier this morning, I was talking about this and, we were discussing sort of a business opportunity that we're working on. And we were talking about, trying to bring people in. And I was like, God, but I keep bringing it up to people, but just nobody raises their hand. Nobody seems to want to involve. They all seem to like me. We all seem to get along. They all seem to dig the idea, all that stuff. But this particular idea looks very polished. It looks nice, has nice marketing behind it. And it occurred to me that, not unlike you're working a million miles a minute, I got so far down the road, there was no room for other people's ideas to be a part of it, right? Like I already knew what it was. And now I'm telling you to get involved, but it's not your idea, So like, why would you raise your hand? Yeah. And so it was an interesting revelation. And that was literally just this morning. So it's interesting to think about this sort of as an ongoing process, that there's no fault in being wrong, but understand that this is something we can work on all the time.
Absolutely. And I think, that's the point, isn't it? You put the feelers out there. You start to understand when something is genuine, when something might have an agenda behind it. You're careful in who you ask to start out with, and you ask an array of different people from different kind of quadrants of your life, because your family and your friends are going to say one thing, your professional acquaintances are going to say another, the leaders, etc. So that 360 can be hugely helpful. And again, you can choose, you have the choice. You can choose what you decide to do with it. You can choose to adopt it, or you can choose actually to take it with a pinch of salt, or you might go deeper and ask them, if you're able to, what exactly does this mean? Can you give me some examples of where it shows up? And if they're able to, that's where the beauty comes.
I love that. So let's sort of, I guess, I mean, obviously you could spend the whole episode here talking about self-awareness. I mean, it's such a huge topic, and really each component of emotional intelligence sort of is that way. But can you give us sort of a top level overview? Like, what types of things are we talking about? Self-awareness is obviously one of them, but what are some of the other aspects of emotional intelligence?
So the next kind of column of this particular grid is all around self-management. And that's that choice between reacting and responding. And this is kind of divided into four within the model that I'm talking about here. You've got emotional self-control. So when something does come up and when you recognize it coming up, what's your decision? Are you going to go with it, or are you going to let it rise a little bit more and then decide it's not going to serve you and you park it, or you just let it go? There's also adaptability within this space. Now, how critical is that as a competency right now? Those people who have been able to cope with such dramatic change. And we see this, don't we, in remote work, being adaptable, being able to work in asynchronous communication, being able to pivot to one project to the next, and all of those wonderful kind of characteristics. So adaptability is your ability to self-manage your emotions and how you crack on. Achievement orientation is the next one. And this is really around how you are able to see it's kind of like an aspirational type thing. It's your ability to have the drive to want to achieve stuff. That's the way you're wired. That's the way you want to be. You want to get stuff done. You want to be successful. Not necessarily on your own. You take people with you, but you are driven that way. And that's connected to positive outlook. We know, don't we, that a positive outlook or a positive state of mind is connected with resilience. So actually being able to bounce back, being able to see the realistic positive picture can help you quite significantly in times of massive change. There are two other headings at social awareness and relationship management. And the idea is that you only crack relationship management really when you have the other three in good order. And so social awareness includes empathy and all of its manifestations. Organizational awareness is where you know who are the players, what is the vibe, what's really going on in this organization. Okay, so we've got the hierarchical organizational chart, but who are the real players? What's your sense of really what's going on? I love that box because so often you kind of read the room, you read the way people are speaking, the way people are behaving, all of that non-verbal stuff, and you can spot who the decision makers are, and they're not who you think they are. And this final relationship management bit, that's the influence, that's the coaching, the mentoring, the teamwork, the inspirational leadership. So you've got 12 competencies sat within one skill. And that's why it's taken me a while to get to this point, and I'm still on a journey.
Well, yeah, I can only imagine. I mean, obviously there's so much to unpack in terms of being a human, being a leader, being everything, to really be proficient at any of these categories. That, it does take, a tremendous amount of work to learn it, let alone to actually put it into practice. So I can understand why this has taken so much time. There are a couple of things you hit on there that are of particular interest to me. They've come up a lot recently. And the first one I wanted to talk about is this sort of, this agility or resilience, this ability to sort of bounce back. One observation that I've had somewhat recently as I've been talking to a lot of different remote workers is sort of the difference between your run-of-the-mill remote worker, the guy who made a choice, or guy or gal who made a choice to go into remote work for one reason or another. Maybe they did a little research before switching careers, going from co-located office to a remote office, or maybe they just took a job at Twitter or Facebook or whatever and happened to be working remotely. And then comparing them to the people who are sort of work from home, who have been forced that way as a result of COVID. And one of the things that I'm observing is that for our people who are sort of remote worker by choice, they tend to have like a little bit of a resilience to them about these ideas about isolation, depression, things like this, the things that come up among remote workers. I guess maybe just because they have some awareness of it, right? If they've done any amount of research, there's no shortage of articles on the subject. And I suspect, if you're trying to, I guess, prep so that you might find a remote job or something like that, you will have learned a little bit about that. For our work from home guys, the people who are being sort of forced to work from home, maybe whether or not they wanted to work remote or whether or not they have any interest in working remote, I feel like they're being a little bit more blindsided by some of these things, and they're starting to feel emotions and starting to be triggered by things that maybe they didn't recognize before as being problems, but now they're kind of living it, right? And so they don't necessarily have the same resilience, even though they might be great in an office environment or something. They're being exposed to something they didn't expect or didn't see coming down the pipe, because so much of the discussion around remote work is, oh, well, you just take your laptop and you work from home, or you go to the coffee shop. Well, in the before time, you went to the coffee shop.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you had any thoughts about sort of developing resilience as sort of a skill set or as a competency, and how we can maybe, become stronger or become more resilient, sort of more mentally fortified, I guess.
There's quite a lot in there. So I think I'll start by talking around the environment first, and then I'll talk about some of the techniques that people can use to recognize an opportunity to become more resilient. So I think the first thing, people who are remote workers do have a particular expectation of how they'll do their work and how the organization will work with them. And certainly from my observations, we've had this situation where people have worked in an office, and if you can imagine, they've kind of lifted, it's like a cut and shunt, they've lifted and plonked the same structure, the same culture, the same behaviors, but in a completely different environment. And it's quite disorientating, because if you can imagine, from what I've seen anyway, people who work in distributed teams have completely different sets of assets and channels even to help people feel connected, because they recognize that people are working in these environments. They need to be reassured, or they need to be over communicated with. We have communication charters, so we know how Sandra or Ryan want to be communicated with. All of that goes on. So I think it helps the individual adapt to that type of way of working. This emergency working from home is like they've been stranded, because I'm not sure that leaders and managers really know what to do. So they're not necessarily leading, and those individuals who are expected to do back-to-back meetings, because that's what they did in the office, all of a sudden at home while they're looking after their kids and other people in their family, it must be incredibly stressful if you hadn't thought about mentally preparing for that particular transition. So I think that's one thing. The other point around resilience itself is really the ability to bounce back. And if we think about growth mindset versus fixed mindset, it becomes much clearer on why people find it more difficult than others to be resilient. So the growth mindset kind of thinks around, well, this is a bit of an error, but really it's a learning for next time. They'll be thinking about how it's curiosity that they're after. That's why that's the thing that drives them to want to continually develop and innovate, etc. Whereas the fixed mindset likes things to be just so, will absolutely fall in a ditch if it's made one mistake. It's a catastrophe if something's gone wrong. And that really is where I think the learning comes. If you don't have kindness to yourself, if you don't forgive yourself for perhaps making an error here, or being really hard on yourself and punishing yourself because you've done this, and this, then those are the kind of things that you need to work on. The fact is, every one of us has been through dramatic change. We've perhaps left school, gone off to uni, we might have got a first job, a second job, we've moved home. When you think of all of those types of changes, and you realize that you can do it, and hopefully most of the time nothing catastrophic happened, you then start to normalize change. And then you start to think, actually, I am quite capable of dealing with all of the complexity and all of the things that get thrown at me, which then starts to build this resilience. It's really thinking, this is the norm. Change is the norm. I'm either going to have to go with the flow, or I'm just not going to be happy. And perhaps I'm well.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I really like how you said it, normalizing change. I think that that's a really great way of just sort of framing this whole thing, because I mean, even just in your day-to-day operations, I mean, most organizations, if you're wearing more than one hat, for example, I mean, you're probably shifting things and moving around all day, and every day might look a little different. I mean,
Mhm.
change is kind of all around us. It's a given, and there's not a whole heck of a lot we can do about it. And thankfully, it's not pandemic every time, but sometimes it is pandemic, I guess. And so it's great that we can, sort of come to terms with, I guess, or really start to understand how change is just a factor, and the more we can just kind of accept it or roll with it, the better off we are.
Yeah.
So I think that's great.
My mum used to say, "Oh, well, that's happened for a reason, and something better's going to come around the corner." And when I review the last 20 years of my life, I think, do you know what? She was right. And in that moment where everything shifts, just going with it and knowing actually everything's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. Just knowing that and just sitting with it, breathing into it, feeling calm in your body. So when stuff does happen, you get an email where this thing has changed or that thing's been stopped, you can cope.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think maybe it leads into this topic. I wanted to talk to you about sort of the role of the employee versus the role of the employer in our mental health. And, there's a lot of discussion, and even I'm guilty of this. A lot of the times that I talk about, the employer, they sort of become dehumanized, and it's sort of this, machine or something that's supposed to be taking care of us. And so a lot of the attention, or a lot of the perspective I am even guilty of using myself, is this idea that, we're the employer is sort of at the behest of the people who work for them, and they need to be taking care of us. And I think to some degree that's true, but I think there's also some component of sort of self-reliance, or some understanding of how much of this should be our problem. How much are we on the hook for versus our employer.
Yeah. There's definitely something around each individual employee knowing what it needs, or at least trying to find out what it needs in order to feel safe, in order to feel growth, in order to feel, recognized, valued, and all of those kind of things. It really is an opportunity. And this is where it starts getting a bit ropey, really. So if the organization isn't listening and doesn't listen to the employees, that's when I think you get this divide. I think you get here's the individual trying to do the best it can, and here's the employer not holding down their responsibilities to that employee. And it's because the people who are leading the organization aren't listening properly. They don't have the skills to properly tune in to those people they're managing, and those people who are being managed don't feel the opportunity to speak up and to say, this is what I need. This, if you want me to be at my best, to be engaged, to play full out, all these wonderful things, I need these things. And if the culture doesn't allow that freedom of speech, it doesn't allow the vulnerability and courage, then that's an issue. Where there is that type of culture, it's down to the individual to recognize what they need and then to speak up. And it comes back down to self-awareness again, doesn't it? If I had a manager who was really helpful, really supportive, and they were asking, what do you need? And I wasn't able to articulate it, whose opportunity is that lost? It's the individual who hasn't checked it out.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think you mentioned something too that's critical, is that not all managers are created equal, right? They don't all have the skill sets. And back to this idea that I've been sort of, removing the human component of the employer, the almighty employer, like, I mean, the fact of the matter is these people are people too, and they're also experiencing COVID or their own problems, or maybe they lack training or whatever it is. And so, they may not even have the skills to be capable of being the level of empathetic or self-aware or whatever that you need from them. And so I do think it's really important that it's this two-way street, that it's, us working with one another instead of expecting everything from our employer, just as they shouldn't expect us, the coworker or the worker, to do it all either.
I think there's something in that. I think there's definitely the opportunity for everyone to be human. But the other thing that's just come to mind as you were speaking then is, how is the organization enabling the manager or the leader to step up? And what comes to mind is, and I'm not too sure whether it still exists in this way, but there's a lot of talk around Netflix and the fact that they treat each other like adults. That's it. There are lots of policies and there are quite a few rules, but overall it's behavioral expectations. There's no massive framework that says you can and you cannot as an employee, you can and you cannot by being a manager. And if you think about just being an adult and treating people with that level of respect, you would expect to have those open conversations. And to nurture one another. You have a responsibility to your manager and leader, and as they do to you, it's a reciprocal thing. They don't owe you anything. Well, you might think they do, but I don't think they do.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's so right. And obviously I think, having that kind of understanding, I think is going to help people, be better about understanding or being empathetic towards one another. If you can sort of recognize that, neither of you have it all worked out and we need to work it out together, I think it's probably a better place to be. So maybe then from there, let's talk a little bit about just sort of, one of the other aspects you talked about, and we talked about this a little bit with growth mindset, is this idea of positive outlook and developing sort of this positive outlook. And I look at so many of these things. I mean, obviously there is a spectrum of people, right? There are people who this comes very naturally to. They just are positive. They just are upbeat. But I think especially now, and especially the longer this sort of, chaotic world that we're living in, is going on, I imagine that for those who were probably relatively optimistic before, things could slip over time. And so I wonder if you talk a little bit about developing a positive outlook, like, if there's some sort of actionable items or actionable steps outside of just sort of simple awareness that we can do to maybe become a little more positive or reframe things the way we see them.
The practice of gratitude is actually pretty big in here. If you're practicing gratitude, quite a lot of the negative emotions like fear and threat, they subside. It's quite a magical thing. So what I've asked my coachees to do, particularly as they're starting to feel quite worn down by this COVID situation, is to observe even the smallest of things, the tiniest of things. For example, if someone, I'm trying to think of some examples now, the fact that perhaps your son or daughter made you a cup of tea, which is not normal, not a normal state of affairs. If the sun is suddenly shining, or actually if it rains and all of a sudden your plants are growing, just to see some gratitude in things and to really magnify that. And what I found I've been doing for quite a long time now, in fact, is to start the day just writing down 3 things that I'm grateful for. Just 3. And even when you go to bed at night, reflecting on the day and making a note again of 3 things that you're grateful for. And the beauty of this is that with gratitude comes positivity. Because when you're grateful for something, it's usually a positive act. It's something, even a little act of kindness. And what you find over time is that they start to magnify. And then you start to realize, actually, you can dispel the negativity if you choose what you focus on, basically. And if you choose to focus on those little great things, rather than the things that aren't so good, you can develop that particular skill.
Yeah, well, and I think that that's so critical too, along with our self-awareness and all this other stuff, just as a matter of perspective, trying to be grateful for the things that are happening, for good or for bad, back to your mother's idea about, maybe this is tough, but what's coming around the corner is great. I think that that's such a critical skill set, and you almost have to say it out loud to believe it sometimes. Like, even if you have to kind of fake it till you make it a little bit, I think it's an important characteristic or an important habit to get into. I found, one example just sort of in my own life was I used to, whenever somebody would say, hey, how's it going? I would always say, oh, I'm so busy, just slammed. Can't believe how busy I am. Overwhelmed. Everything's busy, right? And that seemed to me at the time like, oh, okay, well, I'm expressing, things are going well because, oh, we're so busy, right? And so in my head, it felt pretty right. But then I started thinking about, how people might perceive that. And it was more like, oh, okay, well, he's too busy to socialize, so I'm not going to call him to do this, or he's too busy for, he doesn't need any work, so I'm not going to send him a project, or, whatever it is, and so I figured out, or sort of believe anyway, that I was putting out kind of the wrong vibe. And so, I have kind of a personality that can be a little flippant or a little jokey or a little whatever sometimes. And so after some thought, I sort of changed the way I handle that to, if somebody says, how are you doing now? They usually get oh, I'm better now, or they get oh, so good, so good, so great, that kind of thing. And, but the idea was basically I changed the perspective or changed my attitude from this, feeling that I was slammed and busy and all this stuff all the time to no, I'm great. And now I'm better because here you are to talk to me. And I found that just even in my own networking and getting to know other people and stuff like that goes a really long way in sort of, shifting the balance and making people feel important. And maybe that sort of segues into the social awareness component, where we can maybe discuss a little bit the characteristics of social awareness and how we can maybe become more socially aware so that we're taking care of those around us.
Yeah. So in social awareness, we have empathy. And empathy is your ability to connect with others. And there's actually 3 levels of empathy. And actually, the reason why I particularly want to raise this is that often emotional intelligence is mistakenly identified as empathy. That's it. That's all it is. When, of course, we know that there's 12 competencies. So the 3 levels of empathy are around, firstly, cognitive. I think I kind of think that I get how you're feeling. I think I get that. I think kind of in my mind, I know how that might be. And the next one is more around how you feel. It's possible that you can feel not exactly the same as the person you're speaking to, because of course you're not them, but it gets to a point where you can connect in a way, because as we know, because we're social animals, we socially connect. You can sense an emotion from someone and you can pick it up. And the final one is around doing something about the feeling that you have. So 3 levels of empathy. And it's really important to kind of question sometimes whether empathy is a real thing or not. I kind of battle with this with my students when I kind of say to them, do you know what? Here's empathy. Everyone talks about it. It must be a thing because everyone talks about it. And yet, how could I possibly know what you're thinking or relate to you in what you're experiencing? I'm not you. I haven't had, these are my students, 19 years worth of being you. It's ridiculous to think, because I come with all my views and all my values and everything else. So I'm going to be looking at you from my, if I put my glasses on, I'm going to be looking through from Sandra's lenses. But the bottom line is, if you are able to use some language, if you're able to ask great questions and to actively listen, that's enough with empathy, because people perceive that you're interested and that they value what you're saying and that they want to say some more. So if we think about social awareness, it's the real skill of properly listening, not only listening to the language that's used, it's listening out for the language that's not used. It's listening out for the sighs, the deep breaths, the speed at which someone is speaking, the even obviously the if you're able to see it, the non-verbal communication, how someone's sitting, where their eyes are going, all of these wonderful things we have as humans of portraying what's really going on within us. And that's having that skill of picking up those types of cues is what social awareness is all around.
Yeah, I love that. And now hearing you sort of break down empathy into these 3 different buckets, you can see how we've, even as empathy is concerned, have probably sort of compressed those into one idea for all intents and purposes. So I love you breaking them out that way, because I think you're so right that we, can sort of, you're a human, I'm a human. I can sort of, form some fundamental idea of what you're saying. I can sort of feel, because I've felt fear, I've felt happiness, I've felt all these things. So I can sort of get it. And then this idea of sort of actually taking action. And, it's interesting, especially in these times, I mean, besides COVID, but just we've had all these sort of, political upheaval and all this stuff going on right now in society. And you've got some people who are maybe taking this empathy thing too far. And so what I liked about what you just said was this idea that, doing your best in those three buckets is kind of enough. Like, I don't need you to be me. I just need you to understand me, or at least be, empathetic to me.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what happens a lot of times is when they go too far on this empathy thing, you end up becoming a little paternalistic, or a little, here, I'm the one to save you because you can't save yourself. And so I think it's really critical to not cross that threshold in empathy, where we are actually caring about other people and allowing them to be them. Without trying to maybe take over, or do, go so far in our action that we're actually taking over what they're trying to do.
It is absolutely critical what you've just said, because there's a fine line between being responsive and caring versus what you just said, taking charge, taking on this type of persona that isn't you, and people are just like, right, well, you're being weird, what's all that about? So it's much better to kind of stop thinking about getting into somebody else's shoes. That's the classic saying, isn't it? Don't worry about that, just observe, just hold the space, just listen, ask great questions, and that's enough. Yeah, great stuff. Great advice for the guys out there, hey?
Yeah, right. So, well, and yeah, that's just the thing, right? I mean, we can all buy a pair of, I don't know, Air Jordans, right? And we're all wearing the same shoe, so to speak, but at the same time, we're still totally independent, totally individual. And it's important that we allow people to be that way.
Absolutely.
So I think that's really great. Let's talk a little bit about, or sort of shift gears a little bit into how emotional intelligence is used in the recruitment process. I think, we've touched on a lot of different topics that probably relate to this, but I wonder if you would sort of talk about, anything specific in the recruiting process that could be improved or is done better by employing emotional intelligence.
So I think there's two sides to this. There's the recruiter, and then there's the potential, the candidate, I guess. So from a recruiter perspective, having tuned in to their own self-awareness and working with other people who also have emotional intelligence means that you're far more likely, I'm going to be careful with this, but you're far more likely to be objective than those people who have absolutely zero self-awareness. I'm just going to qualify that before the listeners go, what is she talking about? So if you think about, you can sense the emotions coming up in you, you have the vocabulary to be able to describe what's happening with you and to attribute where that feeling comes from, you're more likely, because you're externalizing what's going on, it's possible that you are making slightly different judgments or decisions, because the fact is all of us have a set of values, we all have a set of beliefs, we have tons of biases, we absolutely do. And if you are able to recognize how you feel when someone writes something or someone says something on an interview, or if someone does something in a presentation, depending on what, how you're recruiting people, just to sit with that for a minute and see, is that really a valid response from me? Is that really valid? And then checking in with your peers who might, as we've done before, talking about feedback and holding the mirror up, checking in with them. So you're giving the candidate the best opportunity to present themselves, because you're being kind of self-aware in what you're seeing in them. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. I think it makes a lot of sense. And it actually sort of spurred on this other idea. It's a little bit maybe further down the line after we've already hired, I suppose. But, we have talked a fair bit here about sort of some of these skills and developing them. But I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about how we actually measure them. So, if we're training our people, for example, right, I imagine there's some self-assessment tools and things like that. But, so many of these power skills or sort of these, aspects of emotional intelligence are kind of, them when you see them. Like, you can see somebody doing the right thing, but you might not actually be able to quantify that. Is there anything that employers can do to sort of, I guess, keep an eye on this stuff? I mean, I imagine there's some superficial things, right? There's maybe less waves being made, or there's less, complaints to HR or whatever. Like, maybe there's some things like that. But do you have any advice for people on actually, as we're improving these things, how can we recognize our improvement or recognize our gains?
I think the acid test is how people manage under pressure. It's how people manage under pressure and under stress, because the true test of EI is when the chips are down, who's keeping their cool, who's keeping calm, who's getting work done still, and who's not offending people. So I think that you can definitely look at times of change, challenge, perhaps um, times when individuals have been put under immense pressure. That's one thing. But as far as day to day, it's generally how people are communicating, and it's how those individuals make others feel. Remember, this whole thing is not just about yourself, it's about the emotions in others. So even some feedback, and it wouldn't get to complaints, it would be, I love working with Ryan. Oh my gosh, I hope I get onto a project with him again. He totally listens to me. He's always doing this, he's doing that. I really feel engaged. So you kind of get a general vibe as to whether someone is approachable, they're positive without being false, they're authentic, they're true to their word, and all of these types of qualities. And I think, when an organization has people who have these heightened skills, they'll see it. They'll see whether someone creates barriers or creates very uncomfortable situations. And that's another thing. Emotional intelligence is not about just being nice. It's about being effective, but doing it in a way that doesn't destroy relationships. So I think it's kind of people in organizations who make decisions having that awareness of how people are behaving with one another. I mean, how does that sound?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I also think that, it should maybe be said that, we don't need to start practicing emotional intelligence because there's a problem either. I think it could be widely accepted that people, as we mentioned earlier, come in sort of a spectrum of colors, and people are sometimes really good at this or sometimes really bad at it, or really great at certain components or bad at other parts. And so I think that, as a practice, if you're an employer, if you're running a distributed team, it would make sense to be sort of employing these things and working on these things all the time, and not necessarily trying to use it to solve a problem. Maybe you've got a personnel or morale problem. It's not about trying to use this to fix that. Rather, it's sort of a global way of being if you really want to try and be a sort of a people first organization.
But here's the theme that I've noticed only a few months ago, that in fact, some research was done a couple of years ago, and they spotted 8 types of skills that come up very, very frequently with remote workers. And of those 8, 4 sit in parallel with emotional intelligence: adaptability, curiosity, empathy, and I can't remember the 4th one now. But it's like the people who are driven to work in remote working spaces, distributed teams, it's like they naturally have a third of the skills already. I mean, it's amazing. It's like they're kind of drawn to it because they know that they can work super well in that type of environment. They don't need an office environment to do well. They can cope pretty well being remote and using their EI.
Well, yeah, and I think that that's one of those critical things when it comes to sort of definitions around remote work, for example. I think there's this misconception that many advocates are saying that the future of work is fully remote. Everyone must work remote. When I think in reality, most people, at least myself, lean more towards the camp that remote work should be a choice, right? This is about flexibility. It's about your ability to work in a way that best serves your ability to work. So if remote works for you, great. And if it doesn't, that's fine. And I think that goes back to this idea, we were discussing earlier about the resiliency of the people who've been forced into work from home versus those who might have already been looking for remote work or thinking about it. And I think it's just that, right? I mean, there is a set of characteristics, whatever that is. We have people who work remote tend to have an inclination for a certain set of skills that make it work out okay. If you don't have those, you just won't be drawn to it. And so it makes perfect sense, but it's interesting how well it aligns with sort of the emotional intelligence rubrics. So it's really interesting. So here in our sort of last few minutes, I wanted to just talk a little bit about relationship management. That's one of the probably hotter items for me. That's something I try and spend a lot of time on these days is how we can develop better relationships through all kinds of means, through communication, through, other things we've talked about, gratitude, mindset, things like that, and how we can sort of develop our relationships. And I also think that it's clearly by design that there are some parallels in the things we've talked about and how those relate to good relationships, right? If you're going to build a powerful relationship, these foundational things we've been talking about are critical. Yeah. And so I wondered if you'd talk about it a little bit as it pertains to, or as, from the perspective of an emotional intelligence discussion, if you talk about what relationship management really means and sort of the components of that.
Sure. So if we think just for a second around just a reminder, really, noticing the emotions in yourself in order to recognize emotions in others. Because we're social beings, because we want to be recognized, because we want to be understood, because we want to feel valued and significant, being able to play in a team means that you need to be paying total attention to how each individual team player plays a part in the overall team success. So that's one example. So having the ability to use this skill to notice where someone might feel perhaps intimidated by someone else, where someone is speaking too much, where someone isn't carrying the weight of what they need to do, and all of these types of behaviors, that's when, if you do have the skill of emotional intelligence, you might be able to see things and encourage others to do well. No one likes to be told what to do, but people do like to be encouraged, to be guided, to be coached, to be mentored. And that's another section within relationship management, is coaching and mentoring. And that's wonderful thing about leadership too. You can apply emotional intelligence to leadership, because Goleman's written a model which has 6 different types of approaches that you can take. You can take a commanding approach if you need to, because that might be a new starter one day who needs to know the ropes. But then you might want to be more of a coaching style, which is, try it this way. Why don't you try? And, acknowledging that people might make mistakes along the way. So what does all of that mean in summary? What it means is having the cognizance, having the ability to see someone for who they are, and to allow them to be themselves completely, but to observe certain things and to give them some feedback, and to offer up, to invite them to perhaps try a different way. It's not around forcing an agenda. It's not around that whole thing of telling someone all to do all the time. No one really likes working with someone like that. It's nurturing and it's growth, and it's all about getting into stuff together. It's really that reciprocal relationship where you listen and then you speak enough.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think one of the key points there that I really like is this idea of sort of flexibility from a leadership perspective, that, you don't need to be authoritarian with everybody. You don't need to be any certain way with everyone. You're capable of sort of reading a situation and then employing these different skills. So I love that, at least in Goleman's work, he's identified these different ways of addressing a situation, whether it's a coaching approach or whichever, because I think that it is critical to understand that, with people, it's never all or nothing, right? It's not black and white, and you're going to have people who respond better to a coaching approach versus some other type of approach. And so I think it's critical to sort of discuss that fluidity, because I think we have a knack to get kind of caught up or rigid in our ways. Yeah. And, again, maybe this goes back to that sort of fear or aversion to change. And it's, we like to do things a certain way. We get good at it in our way, and this is just how we do it, right? And I think maybe almost like being given permission to be flexible, or, making it clear that it's perfectly natural or part of the process to be a little bit more fluid or a little more flexible, I think is really wise.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when I think of my own relationships, and actually the quality of some of my kind of inner circles, some people I used to go to school with, some people I used to go to uni with, I realize now that actually I used to be like, rah, in your face, because that was what I thought I needed to do. Whereas now I've learned these skills, I listen, and I've learned so much more about my friends. I mean, they're still mates with me. That's a bit of a luck, but I listen more. I receive more information because I'm looking out for more information. And those relationships are so much more rich. If you think of your own relationships with significant others, what is it about? It's about reciprocal, it's about communication, it's about forgiveness, it's all about those wonderful qualities. And it's exactly the same in work. It really is. That's what human species need.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I don't think we're going to get a whole lot better than that. So let's, in closing, let's talk a little bit, just where can people find out more about you or connect to you if they'd like to online, and where can they find you online?
LinkedIn, that's the go-to. That's where I'm hanging out most days. I haven't got time for Facebook or Instagram. It's all going on LinkedIn. So yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. And that's where I'll post what I get up to, things like courses later on in the year, coaching opportunities, all that kind of wonderful stuff.
Great, that's awesome. So we'll make sure to include all the links and stuff in the show notes. And thank you so much, Sandra. This was awesome. This was a really good conversation, and I think there's some good advice in there somewhere. So I think it was a job well done.
Thank you, Ryan. It's been an absolute delight.
Yep, of course. And so thanks to everybody who tunes in this week and every week, and we'll see you all next time.
Bye.
Oh, you anything? I don't know you anything.